Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at a brand new release from Anker SOLIX. This is the C2000 Gen 2. And it's basically the big brother to the C1000 Gen 2 that I reviewed a month or so ago. But unlike the C1000, there actually was no original C2000. So the Gen 2 label on that name might seem a little strange or confusing. In reality, the C2000 Gen 2 is actually a complete redesign of the F2000 model, which if you're familiar at all with the F2000, you might immediately notice that this C2000 Gen 2 is significantly smaller, and I can tell you very noticeably lighter than that F2000, weighing in at a much more manageable 41.9 pounds versus 67 pounds on that F2000. And that's despite having most of the same specs, including a 2400 watt AC inverter and a built-in battery capacity of 2048 watt hours. And those two things right there typically account for probably around 90% of a power station's size and weight. So maybe the C in the new C2000 name stands for compact. I don't know. But like the F2000, the C2000 does offer capacity expansion options up to a max of 5 kilowatt hours. And I've got the smaller 2 kilowatt hour expansion module right here, but they do also offer a 3 kilowatt hour expansion battery option. And if you add that, that's how you would get it to 5 kilowatt hours total, since it does only actually support one expansion battery. But to quickly fill in the rest of the key specs on this C2000, it's got 5 AC outlets here on the front. It also has a TT30 outlet, like the F2000. That makes it easy for quick RV and manual transfer switch hookups. And as you'd expect from an Anker product, it's got the latest high output USB ports with 2 140 watt USB-Cs, one 15 watt USB-C, and one legacy 12 watt USB-A. And it does have, of course, a 12 volt 10 amp car socket. Now for charging options, it will charge with AC wall power at up to 1800 watts, or via solar at up to 800 watts. Or, and this is kind of crazy, you can dual charge this thing off both solar and AC at the same time at up to 2600 watts, which actually makes the C2000 Gen 2 the fastest charging 2400 watt power station currently on the market. And of course, as you would expect, the unit is supported by the Anker SOLIX mobile app, which is really actually a good thing in this case because Anker SOLIX does have an extremely well-designed mobile app offering some of the best app functionality for power stations currently available. But we'll get into some of those details just a bit later. Okay, let's put this thing through the paces and see how it stacks up. All right, it is 8 o'clock in the morning, pretty much exactly. Let's see how long I can run this full-size fridge here in my garage on this C2000. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn on the AC inverter. The reason I think that's an interesting test for a refrigerator is because the refrigerator has a very intermittent load. So there's gonna be times when it's gonna be pulling a fair amount of power, and then those are gonna be very short windows, and then it'll not run for a pretty long period of time. So when I have that AC inverter on for an intermittent load, if that AC inverter is not very efficient, it's going to consume much more power over a longer duration in this kind of test. All right, it is just about 8:20 the next morning, so just a little over 24 hours. The light on the refrigerator is still on. Let's see how we're doing. We should be getting close. We're down to 10%, so I have to keep a close eye on this. It's at 8:21, so 24 hours and 21 minutes so far with 10% left. All right, it is 12 o'clock. So we've got a solid 28 hours of runtime out of this 2048 watt hour power station, which is pretty good because out of a typical 1000 watt hour power station, I typically get about 9 to 10 hours. So 28 hours with double the capacity, it's pretty good. That tells me that this inverter is very efficient. All right, just checked on it. It's 12:15. The inverter is shut down and we are at 1%. And of course, the inverter shut down, that means we do not have power, but it must have just happened in the last couple of minutes. So we're gonna say we got 28 hours and maybe 10 or 15 minutes from this fully charged C2000 with this full-size refrigerator. All right, let's do an AC discharge capacity test on this C2000. I think I've got it fully recharged here. Let me double check. Yep, we are at 100%. Let's go ahead and check the output real quick just to make sure. If we enable the AC inverter, see how many volts we are getting. 121 volts, that's good. And we have the watt hours reset. Let me go ahead and apply a load here. Now this is a 2400 watt continuous AC inverter. So 0.2C discharge on this would be about 480 watts. And let's just switch that over to watts. And we are at 506. All right, so we're going to let this run, and we're going to check back in the morning after the BMS has shut us down and find out how many usable watt hours we actually get out of that rated 2048. All right, looks like our AC discharge capacity test is done running and we are shut down. Let's see where we ended up on state of charge. So showing 1%. Let's go ahead and plug this into grid power and see what we actually ended up netting in terms of usable watt hours of capacity. All right, so out of that rated 2048 watt hours, we got 1,830 usable watt hours through the AC inverter. That is actually an above average, very respectable 89 point something, maybe 89.3, 89.4. So yeah, just below 90% usable capacity through that AC inverter. Very good number. All right, let's do the DC discharge capacity test on this new C2000. I've got this thing fully recharged. We're back up to 100%. And I have got this set to pull 10 amps out of this 12 volt socket over here. So let's go ahead and turn that socket on. And we are reading 13.27 volts. So let me go ahead and start the test and make sure we can sustain at least a 10 amp load per the spec on that port. 10 amps, and we are cooking. All right. Let's let this thing run until the BMS on the C2000 shuts us down, and we will count how many watt hours we actually get from that rated 2048. All right, looks like our DC discharge capacity test has completed. Let me zoom in here on this fairly dim screen so I can give you a look and see what we actually got. Let's first check the state of charge, make sure we are all the way down. And we are at 0%, well, 1%, which is typical. So let's zoom in here. So you can see there in the little dim color there, 1,677.3 watt hours is what we actually got through this DC port output. And that's out of that rated 2048 watt hours. And you might be thinking, so why is that a lower number than the AC output that we got through usable capacity on the AC inverter? Because it's DC, it should come right from the battery, right? Well, not quite. It actually has to go through a step-down converter since this is outputting 12 volts and the battery system voltage is most certainly some number higher than that, probably something in the 30 volt range. And so they have to step that down, and there's some losses similar to what you get when you're converting DC back to AC from the inverter. And that's why that number tends to be lower, and the longer sort of discharge time that this tester gives you at only about 120 watts. And the longer discharge rate, as you can see, this took actually 14 hours and 46 minutes to fully deplete. Well, that's going to have an impact on our number. So that is still a pretty respectable average, 81%. I wouldn't say that's a spectacular number, but it's definitely within the average range for usable capacity out of a DC port. So yeah, 81% out of the DC port on this C2000 is an acceptable number, and more than competitive with other units in this particular capacity class. All right, let's do some load testing on this 2400 watt continuous rated inverter. So we are still pulling 120 volts right now. If I zoom in here for you a little bit, you can see that we're currently at 2269 watts. And I'm basically powering my entire barn off this thing using this TT30 going into my transfer switch up here on the upper right hand side. All right, let me take one of the variable charging speed power stations that I'm actually charging on one of the barn circuits here up a little bit more so we can get this as close as possible to that 2400 watts, and then we'll start the timer. Make sure we can do this for 10 full minutes. And we are at 2475, 2482. So we've overshot it already. Let's see if we can get away with that. All right, we hit the 10-minute mark, no problem. And when I'm not talking, this thing is incredibly quiet. This is one of the quietest power stations I've ever seen. And we are at full out. We're right at that 2400 watt mark. In fact, we're right now 2367. We've kind of been jumping in and out of that just a little bit. But let's see if we can find the tripping point on this and whether or not the voltage will actually drop, because even at 2363 watts, we're still locked in at 120 volts. So let me take it up another 100 watts and see what that does, if anything. Let's just get a timer going. I don't see any overload indicators as of yet. And the voltage just dropped on us for some reason. Yeah, we are right on the edge. So let me just see if I can get it to trip. I'm gonna go ahead and take this thing way up and see what it does. So this is gonna put us with 3000 watts. We're at, 3035 watts. I expect the voltage to drop, although we're holding steady at 118 volts right now, and 3034. And this thing has already been running full out for 10 full minutes. And in the bonus column for 2 minutes, still over 3000 watts. I'm very surprised that we haven't tripped anything. Seems like that voltage variation was a temporary thing, and we're stuck right there at 118.9 volts. I can hear the fans kicking up just a little bit. So we've just broken the 45 decibel mark when I'm not talking. But we're still powering 3000 watts. Now we've dropped again. All right, so yeah, this thing definitely passes the AC inverter load test, but you do want to be aware that once you really try to exceed that 2400 watts, it will periodically drop the voltage on you to keep it from overloading. And it does seem to be a variable kind of thing, but that's not something you want to do when you're trying to also power complex electronics like computers and refrigerators and TVs, for example, things with compressors. Those are things you do not want to starve with voltage. So you don't want those things to ever have to deal with voltage lower than maybe 108 volts on the low end. So yeah, something you want to be aware of. As long as you're not, pushing this thing past 2400 watts, you're getting the full 120 volts the whole time, and then some actually. So as you can see right now, we're at 121.1 volts. So very good inverter performance from this C2000 Gen 2. All right, let's check the AC output noise on this C2000 and see if it is noisy or acceptable for things that involve amplification, like guitar amps, PA systems, or even ham radio applications and things like that. So we'll be able to hear if this inverter is noisy, because it will manifest itself with a fairly noticeable buzzing sound if that is the case. So let's get a baseline on what this sounds like through grid power. I've currently got this plugged in, and let's just hear what it sounds like through grid power. All right, I will have boosted that about 9 decibels so that you can hear it clearly. Let's switch it over to inverter power on the C2000. And now let's hear if it sounds any different. All right, there is a slight difference, but it is nowhere near as pronounced as it was on the C1000. And actually, as a musician, that little slight additional buzz in the amplification system doesn't really give me much cause for concern. So I would say that the inverter noise test on the C2000 Gen 2 is a pass. All right, we're going to do the solar wake and charge test, and you can see it's very dark outside. And I have an Anker 200 watt solar panel set up out there. Now, that is nowhere near maxing this C2000 out. But what we're going to do is go ahead and turn on the AC inverter. And in here, under settings, I have got the AC output mode, smart AC output mode turned off. So it's not going to disable the AC inverter without any use here. It's just going to continue to run down until this little 2% remaining fully depletes. And then I've also got down here something called the output port memory switch, and I've got that turned on. So what's supposed to happen is that when the C2000 runs all the way down, the BMS will shut it down, and it will notice that when it had to shut down, the AC inverter was turned on. So it should auto resume charging via solar in the morning, and then when it reaches at least 10% state of charge, it should turn the AC inverter back on, which is a very cool feature. Because let's say you've got a refrigerator connected to this, and let's say you run out of power in the middle of the night, you don't realize it, but thankfully you've got solar connected. You want the solar to start charging automatically, and then you want the AC inverter to kick back on and start powering your fridge again without you having to go check on it. So that's what this feature is really cool for, if in fact it works the way that it should. So we're going to check back in the morning, and we're going to see if it's resumed solar charging on its own, and then we'll check back a little bit later in the morning, maybe early afternoon, and we'll see if the AC inverter has turned back on. So, see you in the morning, and we'll see how all this shakes out. All right, it is a little bit after 9 in the morning, and as you can see, I didn't get optimal placement on that solar panel because the sun is right behind that tree. I suspect I got a little bit of sun on the panel when it was a little bit lower in the sky, but right now we are in basically complete shade. I can see that the C2000 has a power light. Let's just see if it's doing anything. All right, we're getting a whopping 6 watts, but it is charging. So that's a good sign. I'm just gonna not touch it from here on out.
I'm not touching it though!
And see if it continues to increase once the sun gets over that tree and actually starts putting some photons on the panel, a little bit more intensity. So, check back in a bit. All right, it is a few hours later. I did reposition the panel because it was getting shaded a pretty fair amount. And as you can see, we're currently pulling in 108 watts. So far we got to 16%, and the AC inverter is back on. So it did re-enable the AC inverter. So that port memory function definitely does work, which is very cool. All right, let's find out what kinds of power tools that you can run using this C2000 Gen 2. Now, as a 2400 watt rated inverter, I think power tools is a fair game use case for this. So we're gonna kind of test 3 different levels of inrush current, starting with my Craftsman 3 horsepower, 8 gallon shop vac. And I did test the inrush current on this, and this came out to 27 amps. And we are going to monitor the voltage to see if there's any voltage drop here on the watt meter on the startup. So we're gonna keep an eye on that while we turn the shop vac on. We're gonna see if the voltage drops substantially at all. All right, no trouble starting up and running that shop vac. I saw the voltage drop briefly to about 117 volts, and that's actually plenty. I really don't want to see this go below about 108 volts. So anything north of that should be absolutely fine for these power tools. All right, so the next one we're going to do is the Ryobi 10-inch table saw. And in testing that, this pulled actually significantly more inrush current at about 51.7 amps. So I'm going to go kick that on, and we're going to see if that causes any significant voltage drop as well. A little hard for me to see that. There we go. All right, here we go. Now, that watt meter is not super fast in terms of updating the voltage sample rate, but I did see it drop only to about 119 volts. It probably did drop slightly below that somewhat, but I wasn't able to catch it. Still, ran the 10-inch table saw without any issue, and I know, like I said, this has an inrush current of around 51 amps. All right, so the big guy is this Hercules 12-inch miter saw, and this has an inrush current of about 64 amps. So let's go see what that does and whether or not that'll run, and whether or not there's any significant voltage drop. And we're starting, by the way, if you can make that out, about 121 volts. All right, I did see that drop momentarily to 110 volts. So there is a slight voltage drop, but it is not a sustained voltage drop. So this C2000, I think, should be capable of running just about anything that you want to run with it in the 120 volt range. So definite pass on the power tools test. All right, let's wrap up with some final comments. I did test the idle consumption on this unit off camera, and it calculated out to an eye-poppingly low 10 watts continuous. and actually slightly under that. I think it was like 9.5 watts. And that is a significant advantage compared to, I think, what is a much more common idle consumption of around 15 or 16 watts for a typical 2400 watt inverter. And that explains why this unit can run an intermittent load like a full-size fridge freezer for over 28 hours like we saw. Now, that's just excellent performance all the way around. And I just wanted to quickly follow up on the inverter load test that we saw, because I found it a little bit curious that we had an initial momentary voltage drop around the 2475 watt load mark, and then it stabilized and it held steady at 118 volts even after we had slightly exceeded the 3000 load mark, and until it finally then dropped again. And upon further investigating that, what appears to have happened with that first voltage drop was that since I had this expansion battery connected and I had not yet bothered to fully charge it so it could be in state of charge balance with the main C2000, this actually only had 10 or 15% state of charge on it when we started the load testing. And so what actually happened during that first voltage drop was that the expansion battery had reached depletion and had to drop out, and the C2000 then switched over to its own battery source, so the built-in battery capacity. And so the battery expansion is typically first to be discharged and then last to be charged, which makes sense when you think about it. So I'm fairly certain that had I fully charged the expansion battery before we started that load test, we would have never seen that first voltage drop at all, and we would have only seen the one that happened at around the 3000 watt load mark. So I just wanted to explain that just a bit further. But one other thing that I wanted to point out during that load test that I thought was definitely noteworthy was just how quiet this unit was, and unbelievably quiet. The peak volume that we registered was about 46 decibels, which definitely makes this thing probably one of the most quiet power stations that you can buy, certainly in this class. And then just to drive the point home about how much smaller the C2000 Gen 2 is as compared to similar units, just look how much bigger this EcoFlow Delta 2 Max is next to the C2000 Gen 2. And yet they have basically exactly the same specs, 2048 watt hours, 2400 watt inverter. Now the C2000 is 18 inches wide in this direction here. It's just under 10 inches deep and just slightly over 10 inches high. And you do the math on that, the total volume of the C2000 is 1800 cubic inches. And by comparison, the total volume of this Delta 2 Max with the same inverter and battery capacity is 2,234 cubic inches, which means that this Delta 2 Max takes up about 24% more space than the C2000 Gen 2. And it doesn't even have that versatile TT30 outlet like the C2000 does. Now, I'm sure if you're an RV or van camper, you are no doubt aware that space is almost always one of the things that you have to be the most careful about managing. And so being able to get the same or maybe even better functionality out of something that takes up almost 25% less space is not an insignificant detail. All right, so we can't really wrap up without talking about price and warranty. Anker SOLIX warranties the C2000 Gen 2 like all of its other power stations for a full 5 years, which is definitely worth more when it's offered by a well-established brand that you know is going to be around in 5 years to honor that warranty. Now on the list price on this unit is a hefty $14.99, but don't panic quite yet, because during this brief pre-sale period, if you sign up for the pre-sale discount using the link that I put down in the description below, you can actually get the C2000 Gen 2 for a very aggressively low price of just $749. But to get that price, you do have to sign up for it by October 27th. Now, starting on October 28th, the price does go up, but just a little bit to $799 during the official launch period. So in any case, with either of those prices, that's an extremely good pricing for a premium tier power station in this 2400 watt and 2048 watt hour class. All right, I think we've covered just about everything, but if you still have any lingering questions about this guy, let me know in the comments section below, and I'll be happy to try and answer those questions for you. And then also, please do let me know what you guys think about this new release from Anker SOLIX. Does this check most of the boxes for you? Like, how would you guys be most likely to use a power station like this? So let me know down in the comments section. Okay, I think that's a wrap. I do hope you found the video helpful in some way, and if you did, please do me a small favor and click that like button down below for me. I'd very much appreciate that. And consider subscribing if you're not already a subscriber. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today on this video, and I do hope you'll come back and join me for the next one. Until then, have fun out there.